Everyone and welcome to Java tutorial for beginners, the only resource you need to learn Java from scratch with no programming experience required. This tutorial has 5 parts that you can find in the Java programming playlist, and in this last video we're going to build a small project where we process some files using the concepts we learned in the other 4 videos of this tutorial. So without further ado, make sure to hit the like button and let's jump into it. Alright, so in this lecture we're going to make a really simple project that will allow you to understand the way we can connect a couple of things together. We're going to interact with some files and strings to kind of get the main idea on how to build a project from the scratch that really does something more or less useful, right? So what we're going to do is to first create one file here by going on the source directory and on the new and then on file, and we're going to call this input underscore file.txt. In this file we're going to have some strings. They can be something like passwords. So let's say we got those 4 strings here, and what we want to do is to hash those passwords and write them on a different file. So hashing a password means that we want to take a string and apply on it a hashing function that will transform that string into a different string which has a fixed length, and it's kind of unique. This is basically how it works. And why do we need this? Because usually in web applications, when you're storing the password of a user on the backend or on the database, you don't really need to store the exact value of the password, the exact string that the user actually types, because if the database is compromised, you're going to lose access, you're going to compromise the access of that user to the account, right? And you don't really need this. Instead, you can just take the password, hash it, and then an attacker which got access to the database cannot see the original password because hashing functions are not reversible. I really recommend you to take a look on the web for the hashing topic in general to kind of make an idea on what this actually means. So of course the main topic here would be to play with the file, to connect a couple of things together. The hashing function will be of course taken from the internet because there are already some ways to do this. But now let's go back to the code and start doing the actual project. So there are a couple of steps that we need to make here. The first one is to read the content of the file. And in order to do this, we have a couple of options in Java, but I'm going to use the simplest one for this lecture. And the simplest one is to create an object of the type file, right, that we're going to call input file. And on the constructor of this object, we need to provide the path for that file on the local disk. And in order to grab that path, you need to locate the file on your local disk. And in order to do this, I'm going to use the terminal because right now I'm already in this directory, and it's basically the easiest way to do this using the terminal. If you just hit the pwd command, that's on Linux and macOS. On Windows, there is a similar process. You can take this path and pass it here as a string. And on the end of that path, you need to add the file name, right, in order to identify the file on your disk. And I'm going to make this a little bit smaller. So this is how we identify a file on the local disk using an absolute path. So this is a path which basically goes from the root directory, follows all the other directories, and it finally goes to this file name, right, in order to identify. And now once we created this file object, we need to create a scanner object as well. This particular scanner class will allow us to actually go through the file line by line. And on the constructor of this scanner class, we have to pass the file object that we just created previously. And as you can see, we have an error here. And this error is telling us that we have an unhandled exception, which is basically a file not found exception. Exceptions in Java are basically ways to signal the fact that something went wrong when the program has been executed. And in this particular case, the situation that may go wrong is that the file is not found on the local disk, right? So for that particular reason, Java is forcing us to handle this exception. And we're not going to go into the exception handling mechanisms because this is kind of a little bit more advanced topic. We're just going to use what the IntelliJ IDEA is recommending us, which is to add the exception to the method signature. And as you can see, it basically adds this throws clause here on the signature of the main method, which is telling us that the main method can throw this exception up on the stack trace. For the moment, this is exactly what we need. So now that we have the scanner object, we need to use it to actually get the content of this file. And in order to do this, we're going to use a while loop to iterate over the lines of this file. And we're going to say while, and the condition of the while is while scanner dot has next line. The scanner object has this very convenient method which returns true or false, right? So a Boolean value if we have a new line in the file or not, right? So this condition is exactly what we need for this particular loop, right? Now the next step is to actually grab the line from the file, and we need to do this by using the scanner dot next line. Those methods can be actually learned from the documentation of the class, or you can check them on the internet. You're not basically required to know them up front because they are a lot, you know, so you just have to kind of play with this particular class to get to know the methods actually. So in this particular line string, we're going to have the next line on the file. And let's print it out on the screen to see that we actually managed to read the content of this file. Okay, so as you can see, we got exactly what we have in this file, right? Password 1, the strongest password, password 3, and password 5, and so on. Now let's see what happens if this file is an inexisting one, right? So I don't have this file name on the local disk. Now, if we run the code, we're going to see this final found exception as being thrown, right? So as you can see, this is how it actually looks like, right? So if when you're trying this out, if you're seeing this exception, most probably your path to the file is not correct. So you need to fix that, right? I'm going to undo this change. So now what we need to do is to basically open an output file, which is the file where we want to place our results. And we just have to write in that file the hashed version of those passwords. And in order to do this, we're going to create a different file object, which is called output file. Right? I'm going to also change the name of the file, of course, to be a different one. The path will be exactly the same. So we're going to see the output file right below the input file. And let's say just as a test, that we want to write the exact same line that we just read. So we just want to test the fact that we managed to write some data in a file successfully. Now, to be able to write data on a file, we have to use the file writer class. And this class takes a file object as a parameter, and it also throws an IO exception for that case, for the situation where you don't have access to write data on that file. So now what we need to do is to basically use this writer to write data on that particular file. And we have a write method which takes a string as a parameter that we can actually use. And really important is that whenever we work with files, and this applies in general whenever we work with pretty much any resources in any Java application, we need to make sure that we close them properly. In this particular case, the file writer has a method which is called close. And this close method is really important because it tells the operating system to close the file descriptor which has been used to access that file. So if you're not closing the resources and you run the program multiple times, I mean, tens of thousands of times, or even simply thousands of times, you're going to see that file descriptors accumulate in your operating system. And this is definitely something that we don't want. So the rule of thumb is to always close resources when you're playing with them in Java and in pretty much any programming language. And also we need to close the scanner, right? Because this is the object that we use to read data from the file. So now if we run the code, we should see the output file being created right below the input file, right? So as you can see here, this is exactly what happens. But as you can see, the strings here are basically placed one after the other and not on different lines. And this happens because this write operation writes the line exactly as it's being read from the input file. So in order to place them on different lines, we need to add here a \n or a new line character. This character will basically fix the issue, right? So if we run the program again, we can see that the lines are being placed properly. And also we have a new line at the end, right? Because the last string which has been written contains that new line character, right? So for that reason, we have an empty line in the output file. Now, of course, we want to hash those strings. So for that reason, we're going to make a method which is private in this case because we don't want it to be used from the outside of the class, that will basically hash a string. So we're going to say that this method returns a string and we're going to simply call it hash. And it basically takes an input as a parameter, which is again a string, and it returns a different string. And in this method, we're going to have the actual hashing logic, right? The place where we use this method is, of course, before writing the line in the output file, okay? So exactly in this place, right? We basically first hash the string, we add a new line after it, and then we write the hashed result on the output file. Now let's see how this hash method actually looks like. So on the first web search, we can find this particular hash function that we can use to hash a string in Java in a very simple way. So we basically use this message digest class, which is found on the standard Java library. And we basically take an instance of it, we update it with the bytes of the input string, and we finally call the digest method, which basically does the actual hashing operation. And this result we're going to wrap into a new string and return it back to the caller. As you can see, we're using this SHA-256 algorithm, which is one of the best hashing algorithms out there. But this is currently not important for this particular lecture, right? So if we run this code now, we should see the hashed results on the output file, right? And if we go on the output file, the reason we're seeing those characters here is because they are non-printable. So the hash combination of bytes that this message digest actually generated cannot be interpreted by this text viewer of IntelliJ IDEA. So to fix this, we need to make this hash result in a base 64. And to do this, we just have to say base64.getEncoder encode to string. This will basically provide us a more printable version of the result, right? So as you can see, this is how it looks like. So we have regular characters and numbers. Now, as I previously mentioned, the property of this hash function is that if you take the same string and pass it onto this function, it will generate the exact same hash. But if you provide a slightly different string, it will generate a completely different hash, right? And the whole idea is to just not be able to correlate the input with the output in any way. So you can basically use this particular code whenever you have a project that you need to store passwords in a database or anything like that, right? This is actually a best practice in the industry to not store the actual passwords, but to hash them properly. All right, so this is actually your first Java project. It's a very simple one, of course, but it kind of uses a couple of concepts which are really useful to know and also to understand. Feel free to play around with pretty much any aspect of this code to see exactly what happens behind the scenes, right? You can also check the underlying classes, the underlying methods by using the command or control and click on each of them to get a really great understanding on how those actually work. So with that, let's jump into the next lecture.